Hey, it's Fitz, and if you don't know who I am, here's a quick bio. I'm a veteran sports journalist who writes, does TV, radio, daily YouTube videos, and I'm a longtime podcaster. Also, I have metastatic stage 4 prostate cancer that came out of remission in January of 23. During the pandemic, my doctors advised me to stay at home, and the Life of Fitz podcast was born. My original diagnosis forecast that I would be dead by age 60. But as I start season 5 of this podcast, I am 60 and still calling the many friends, athletes, coaches, colleagues, and medical advisors who I've met throughout my life. Oh, and I'm still hitting the record button and now doing so on video. Welcome to my life and the Life of Fitz podcast. Presented by the great people at Blueville Nursery in Manhattan. In many ways, Tim Weiser brought Kansas State University athletics into the modern era. I mean, he was the first AD to come in the 21st century, coming to K-State from Colorado State in 2001. Before then, K-State was still kind of operating like that sleepy little ag school that is always going to be behind in facilities and not expect too much from success. Well, Weiser started to change that. Now that movement was carried on and accelerated until the point we're at now, but he was coming into an interesting situation in 2001, and he had no intentions of leaving Kansas State. He was one of the most likable and kind of laid back bosses you could ever see, but he got things done and he made tough decisions that were sometimes unpopular. However, he knew one thing didn't need to be messed with, and that was Bill Snyder. And unfortunately, during his tenure, Bill Snyder did retire, and a decision was made to hire Ron Prince. It's a decision that sticks with K-Staters, and I'm just going to tell you, even if Tim doesn't, that it wasn't his choice. And soon after that, Tim decided it was time to move on, that maybe the direction from above wasn't the direction he wanted. So he went to the Big 12. And it seems like just yesterday, but last year at Big 12 Media Days, he told me he was retiring. And then somewhere along the line, it got extended a year, as you'll find out. And so this will be his final Big 12 Media Days. I am heading to Vegas the morning this releases. And I will be there for 3 nights covering Big 12 football because they couldn't get in at Arlington for various reasons. This year it's in Vegas. I'll get to see Tim there. I'll get to see all my media buddies there, and I'll get to work a whole lot. Oh, and I'll be in Vegas. So to get you ready for all that's coming with Big 12 Media Days, let's call my buddy, Tim Weiser in Dallas, Texas, who still works for the Big 12. He keeps saying he's retiring, but I don't think he will. And now let's bring in Tim Weiser from somewhere in Dallas. Do you still have an office at the Big 12 office?
I do, yes. Mm-hmm.
But you retired?
No, I have not yet officially retired. The end of the year.
I was going to say, you're not very good at retiring if you still have an office.
No.
Okay, but you're like consulting and...
Well, I will be after I finish my full-time duties and responsibilities later this year. So,
okay. I was a year ahead.
No, I had originally planned to a year ago, and then I had a conversation with Brett, and we decided to push it back another year. And so that's what this year has been. One more cycle. So soon it'll be coming to an end.
So this actually airs on the 7th, whatever it is, that Monday, before Big 12 Media Days. Will you be there?
I will be. Okay, yes.
Good. We get to talk now and see each other later.
Sounds good.
Let's start there, though. I mean, I know that it couldn't be in Dallas. What went into the choice of Las Vegas?
Well, I think part of it, if not most of it, was as a nod to the fact that we're bringing in these 4 corner schools. And that's kind of been an area that they've benefited from and used over the years in the Pac-12. Mm-hmm. So I think that was a large part of it. I'm not sure that long-term that will be a location that we would continue to use, because I still think that the availability of flights and the ease of travel to and from Dallas for all of our member institutions and the corresponding media is really good. Not to mention that it's probably going to be a little toasty out in Las Vegas this time of year, but it is in Dallas. So I guess that's the same either way. But, it made sense having it out at Cowboy Stadium because of our football championship. And I think if they weren't going through some of the issues in preparation for World Cup and some of the renovations, we would have probably continued to be there.
Yeah. Well, that's a lot easier trip for me and a lot of the media, but this is a much more fun trip. If you can have fun at these things.
Yeah.
These
Good
things
question.
are a lot more of a grind than people realize.
There is a lot of information that comes flowing out of those meetings. That's for sure.
Well, let's go back to your journey to K-State and your decision to move on. What are your best memories or some of your most outstanding memories from your time at Kansas State?
Ooh, wow, Matt.
I'll just sit back. You take the next 30 minutes. I'll just sit back.
Okay, Tim, I appreciate that. I would have to tell you that I took that job in large part because it was a chance for me to come home. And at that time, my dad's health was not great. But I was able to spend a couple more years with him there in Kansas. So that certainly would have been one of the things I was most grateful for. But, in totality, the people, boy, you hear this all the time, but those were people that I was comfortable with. They were the kind of people that I grew up in Western Kansas with. And so I enjoyed very much the myriad of people that I had a chance to spend time with. But from the work standpoint and the ins and outs of the job, I would tell you that it turned out to be exactly what I thought it would be. Certainly it was challenging. The opportunity to work with Coach Snyder was one that I really, really am thankful about. Learned so much from him, really benefited by watching how he paid attention to detail and what he did to make that football program the success it was. And I would tell you at the top of that heap of successes, watching our team beat Oklahoma and Kansas City in that championship game still, I would have to tell you of my entire career might be at the very top of enjoyment.
It was an amazing day.
Oh my gosh. I still remember riding in the car with John Weefall to that game. And, the conversation was about keeping it close because, as you recall, Oklahoma was thought to be not only the best team in the country at that time, but perhaps of all time. Right. There were a lot of national media that was suggesting that. And so I think there was in the back of a lot of people's minds, could we keep that game close? Could it be a respectful game? And boy, to remember what Darren Sproles did and the L. Roberson experience, it was phenomenal. And I remember seeing Darren a couple of years ago in Las Vegas when he got inducted out there for the football and having that conversation with him. And I told him at that time that was still my favorite memory in my time at Kansas State. And he just, of course, had a big smile on his face. But that would be at the top of the list for sure.
That was an incredible day.
Yeah, it really was. And, leaving Kansas State, frankly, Tim, was not something that I envisioned, at least at that juncture. I kind of took that job with the idea being that it was going to be my last job. And I certainly thought it would be, 15, 20 years if things worked out. But things started to change a little bit. The Ron Prince hiring was one that I knew was risky. Bringing in somebody that hadn't had any head coaching experience in any head coaching position is always going to have some risk. But, following Bill Snyder was a tall order for anybody. And I can't tell you, Chris Kleiman has probably engineered that better than anybody could have possibly thought. The job that he's done and Gene's done with that program. But I had hopes that it was going to, as time went on with Ron, settle in. And it was starting to appear as though it wasn't. And I had my opinions about what the long-term plan should be, and others had a different opinion about it. And so it just seemed like, I was starting to potentially get in the way of what others wanted to do with football. and I had the opportunity to come to the Big 12 and work as deputy commissioner with, at that time, Dan Beebe. I'm on my 4th commissioner since Dan. But it was probably a change that was best for K-State and best for me, given the dynamics at that time. And that might be one of the low points for me, because it was tough to leave Kansas State. And that wasn't the way I envisioned my career ending.
So was that around 08? I can't remember exactly.
Yeah,
okay.
It was. Mm-hmm.
So you've been down there for quite a haul.
16 years.
Yeah, that's incredible.
It really is.
But it does intrigue me that you kind of left K-State and got out of the AD business, so to speak, right about the times ADs got a lot more visible than they had been. And conference commissioners weren't visible back then.
Yep.
It's amazing how it's evolved. And now being an AD is a very public job, almost like a head coach.
There's no question, Tim. Those jobs have changed so much. Conference commissioners, as you said, have changed so much. I still remember at my press conference at Kansas State, I think it was Bob Lutz that asked the question about, how I viewed being an athletic director. And at that time, and I still believed at that time, it was the right approach, was similar to being a good official, that if you did your job well, nobody really knew your name or what you did. They just knew that that wasn't an issue. Your officiating didn't become the focal point. And so I was always more comfortable being behind the scenes than I was at the front. And thankfully at K-State, we had a lot of people that wanted to lead the parade. So it was a good thing for me to want to sweep up after the parade. And so, I thought the combination was a good combination for us.
Occasionally there was a lot of sweeping needed.
Well, believe me, I've done my fair share here in the Big 12 too. So that's always part of it.
True. Historically speaking, I think you sit on the right side of history with Ron Prince, but we won't go any deeper than that.
Well, thank you. There's plenty more we can talk about.
Yeah, there really is. I don't want to get lost in those years. How radically different was it when you left Kansas State, left the athletic department setting and moved into a conference?
Yeah, it was a lot different than what I had envisioned. In large part, and I watched Bob Bowlesby go through this when he left Stanford. You as an athletic director, you have a lot of skin in the game, and you have teams to cheer for and kids that you get to know and facilities that you get involved in. A lot of that goes, in fact, most of it goes away when you come to a conference office, because you become Switzerland in many ways. You don't really have a team that you get to outwardly cheer for. Now, privately and secretly, I've had my favorite team that I've always paid attention to, but you become much more neutral in what you do, and you don't get to know the kids. You don't get involved in building projects, and that takes some time to adjust to it. And as I say, I remember having that conversation with Bob Bowlesby, because he really struggled with that for a while. The flip side of it is, you're somewhat removed from the day-to-day positive drug tests, DUIs, donor concerns. There's just a number of things that you're now flying at 40,000 feet as opposed to 400 feet.
Right.
So, your perspective changes, and I wouldn't have probably been able to last as long career-wise had I continued to be an AD as opposed to being in a conference office, because it's just a different pace, and there's just a different dynamic that takes place in a conference office. Now, having said that, I will tell you, since Brett's arrived, things have changed drastically in that regard. I think conference offices, and in our case, the commissioner, it is a much different job, and he was hired to do a lot different, many different things for the conference than what was done previously. So it's changed, and it will continue to change for us. Now, I don't know if you were to ask Greg Sankey or Tony Petiti if their jobs have changed drastically like they have in the Big 12, they probably would say no. because they're in a different place financially than our conference is. But Brett was hired first and foremost to create new revenue streams. And, our ability to do that is in large part driven by our TV revenues. And, I think we've got two good deals that we're using right now, but there's a whole lot of other things that Brett is trying to do to create more revenue streams for our member institutions. And a lot of that is starting to prove, somewhat prescient in terms of other conferences starting to rethink, well, maybe that's a route we need to go. And maybe we need to consider doing something with naming rights and jersey patches and so on and so forth.
Yeah, that's the naming rights of the conference is an interesting one. But you at this point, you can't turn down money, can you?
Well,
I feel like in some ways you're selling yourself like Bulls did, but you either do it or you don't keep up.
Well, I mean, you take Brett's background in NASCAR. He's certainly very familiar with the NASCAR approach and what they do. But then you see what the CFP does. CFP is, I would tell you that their approach is more like the Masters in that less is more. And trying to strike a balance that makes sense for a conference, its member institutions, is, I think, a fascinating one because, as you say, and as I know with our ADs, they're facing some pretty significant changes to their financial model. And we have to remind ourselves in the conference office, that's the very first thing that those member institutions expect out of us, is to drive revenue for them. And it's now more important than it's ever been because of this potential settlement, what that's going to require ADs to do when it comes to sharing revenue. And so a lot of this, I think we were eventually going to get to, but it's been enhanced and sped up a lot by these recent court cases.
Yeah. And again, it is a lot of the court cases that's redefining college athletics right now, but have the institutions as a whole across the NCAA taken enough steps to kind of put up guardrails, or has there been too much sideline watching?
Yeah, boy, that's a great question, Tim. If you look back and see some of the major changes that have occurred in the last 5 years with what we do in terms of the revenue that we are sharing to this point with student athletes, a lot of what you would see was driven by Judge Wilkin and the Ninth Circuit decisions. And we used to talk, Bob and I, about how, the only time you see change really occur in the NCAA is when there's been a court case and a lawsuit that's forced a judge to say, no, here's what you're going to do. We just, as a group, have a hard time coming together and making those kinds of decisions because everybody has a different perspective. And what we want to do at Kansas State isn't what necessarily, pick your school, Austin Peay wants to do. Or, right. There's so many different perspectives that it's hard to get anybody to agree on a course and a path that you want to proceed.
How much direction does the conference office offer their member schools on these things?
Well, I think, when you say these things as it relates to legal matters,
all the stuff that, the portal, the NIL, all the transitional stuff that has come out of these court cases.
Yeah, I think we offer more than perhaps we've ever offered in the past, in part because I think the members are trying to figure out what direction to go. But ultimately, I think our role in the conference office is to tee up these issues, to give the member institutions an opportunity to discuss, debate, vote. And if they reach a point where they can't decide, then I think it is the responsibility of the conference office to say, here's what we recommend. And that seems to be happening more now than ever when it comes to suggesting a course and a path to go down. This settlement issue was a prime example. There were a lot of schools that weren't comfortable with this. And it was in large part because, Tim, you could envision a scenario where an AD is talking with donors about how this came to be. How did we get to the situation that we're having to share $20 million worth of, or thereabouts, of revenue with our student athletes? And if you agree to the approach with the settlement, you could say, well, we all signed on for this and thought it was the best course of path, as opposed to going to court, taking the chance of losing, which I think everybody thought that would be the outcome. And then those damages would be triple.
Mm-hmm.
So you tell that to a donor, say, so you mean you guys agreed to do this? As opposed to the other approach is, let's just go to court, let's just lose, and let's just hit the reset button and start all over again. Which then gives the conversation the context of saying, we didn't decide this, the court did, and the judge did. And I think our schools were caught up in trying to understand which of these two paths made the most sense, because we knew that going to court was still probably 2 years away, and the amount of legal fees that we would spend over these next 2 years would have been significant for our conference, our member institutions, versus trying to go down that path now, see if we can reach a settlement and start making the changes that we think make sense for us in the next decade or iteration of what we think intercollegiate athletics will be. So, I think that's the right path. But yet for our ADs, it's going to be a very difficult conversation about how you do that. And I think some of this is probably going to rest with, maybe now facilities aren't the primary keep up with the Joneses arm race that it used to be. You're going to have to redirect those dollars into the student athlete enhancements and revenue sharing. And maybe that's the right answer. Maybe we don't need to be spending the kind of money on facility upgrades that we have for the last 20, 30 years.
No.
But I think it's going to cause some very hard conversations within athletic departments about, we can't be all things to all people. And so we're going to have to figure out what sports we can afford to do this for and what sports we can't.
As you know, Kansas State's at the minimum number of sports that you can offer. Do you see them maybe lowering that floor because of this decision?
I think there's a chance. I think the pushback will be if schools are given the ability to offer fewer sports. I think that gives some green lights to schools that right now are seeing flashing red lights. And make no mistake about it, Tim, there isn't an AD in the country that wants to drop sports. So I think that's going to be the hard thing to predict, is if you give flexibility to say you only need 10 sports, does that open up the floodgates to say, okay, good, we can offload these 6 sports? And they're now club level sports or intramural level sports. And I think you could find a lot of people that would argue, boy, there goes your Olympic movement and the success that you've enjoyed. There goes a ton of opportunities for kids that now will be doing it as a club level team member or an intramural club member. And that's not what everybody wants and believes is the best experience for a collegiate student athlete. So I think the NCAA is going to be forced to grant some relief, but how and what that looks like is hard to predict.
Now, that would certainly fall under the unintended consequences of the lawsuit being filed by a swimmer, the initial one, because it could be a real threat to sports such as that.
No question.
It's a shame.
Look, Tim, if you truly were a business, and right. I've said this for years and years, you'd really be offering the 2 products that generate revenue for you.
Absolutely.
Football and basketball. But we're not a business because Title IX requires us to spend money on the female sports, and thankfully so.
Right.
And, there's some schools that can generate some revenue in baseball and maybe in volleyball and women's basketball and softball, but not to the extent that they offset expenses like football and basketball does. So, we're in a little bit of a bind because we're providing opportunities in sports that don't return the investment that you're making in those sports.
I agree. It's going to be a interesting transition here as schools try to adjust. I don't know how some schools are going to find around $20 million a year. That's
Well,
gonna be painful.
I don't either, Tim, except that I think you're going to be forced to rethink what your priorities are. And maybe you're going to have to say, hey, here are the 6 sports that we're going to make tier 1 sports. And here's what tier 1 means. Here's the 4 sports we're going to make tier 2. And here's what tier 2 means. And come up with some sort of tiered approach, which may not be tasteful, because let's just use Oklahoma State. You could find some that would say, hey, maybe wrestling should be a tier 2 sport. Well, at Oklahoma State, there's a national history and success level that would suggest, that's going to be a hard one to carry out if you're Chad
Yep.
Weiber. You're going to have difficulty. And that wouldn't be the case necessarily at Kansas State if they had wrestling, but there's a lot of schools that are going to be faced with that. And as Chad and I've talked about, that's great, but you better find enough other schools that keep wrestling at the same level, or who are you going to compete against? How are you going to make that program continue to be relevant if all your competition has relegated wrestling to a tier 2 or tier 3 program? I'm not saying that Oklahoma State's even having discussions about that, but I think those are going to be the kinds of discussions and conversations that you have to have. And you know what I think about baseball? I love baseball, but again, that's a sport that's not covering its costs. And outside of what you see at the College World Series, there are not many programs around the country that can create the kind of revenue to drive enough dollars to say, it's worth us keeping at this level.
I agree. It's going to be very fascinating to see how this plays out. Let's get go ahead.
No, I guess I'm sitting here trying to reassure myself that this is the part of what happens when you get 66 and you start looking back and you remembering things perhaps better than it was. I can't help but think that, when I got my first AD's job at 30, there were probably a couple of old codgers sitting over there in the corner saying, can you believe that they're going to let women compete in athletics? What are they thinking? So I think this is always about what happens in our industry. It evolves and we continue to adjust. And as you see, we still have an appetite on Saturdays for all things football, on the TV for all things football. We get into basketball season, same thing happens. So it's not like there isn't a continuing appetite and market for our sports. It's just that we're going to have to rethink how we present them and how we provide for them.
Let's take a short break and hear from our sponsor, Blueville Nursery.
For competitively priced landscape design, irrigation, and lawn maintenance, turn to Blueville Nursery, a family-owned business with more than 50 years of experience. You can trust the Blueville team to design and create a landscape that will accentuate your property's aesthetics. And visit our garden store 6 days a week for the best products in the area. From ornamental trees, shrubs, and flowers, Blueville has it all. Blueville Nursery, located on West Anderson Avenue in Manhattan, Kansas.
Now, let's return to the studio. Let's turn our attention real quick to what it's like to work for Brett Yormark. You shared some comments a year ago at Big 12 Media Days about how your life has changed. He literally brings the NASCAR to the office, doesn't he? He's on the go all the time.
No question. I've never, and I've worked for a lot of unique people in my career. Kansas State certainly provided some of those, but I can tell you without question, there hasn't been a president, an AD, a coach that has compared to Brett. He's hard to really explain to people that don't see him day in and day out like I have. And I will tell you, the energy level that guy has is second to none. It is beyond description. I've witnessed it firsthand. He is one of a kind. And thankfully for our league, he's one of a kind, because what he's done in 2 years, I guess we're coming up on his second year here. is nothing short of amazing. I mean, the way he was able to thread the needle with Oklahoma and Texas and their departure. I mean, all you have to look at is what the ACC is going through to realize that could have easily been what we were dealing with here. But he artfully was able to negotiate that in a way that, yeah, maybe it was a little rocky at times, but for the most part, we got through it without a full-scale meltdown and wondering whether that was going to lead to other schools walking and going somewhere else. So, that's one piece, the TV deal that he quickly put together to keep us moving forward. And some of this, I give the blame to the Pac-12 for, or credit to, however you want to look at it, because, they had an opportunity to take something that was presented to them and passed on it, which made it then real easy for ESPN and Fox to look at our opportunity and decide that, yep, we want to do this. And that gave us yet another life preserver that he provided. So that's the short-term benefit that we've gotten from him. I think the long-term is still yet to come because, this guy has asked me on so many occasions, why haven't we ever done this? And more often than not, my answer is, yeah, I can't come up with a good answer for that, Brett. I don't know why. And I think that's what our presidents were hoping when they hired him, is that he would be without blinders. He would come in with a completely wide open agenda and look at what we do in ways that nobody's really ever looked at being a conference commissioner before. And a lot of the ideas, of which he's got 10 a minute, it seems like, are ideas we're still trying to figure out how we can maximize revenues and brand ourselves and separate ourselves from the others. I mean, I would not want to be on the opposing side of a negotiating table with him. I've watched him. He knows how to negotiate. And that's always going to make him, I think, a threat if I were other conference commissioners or other schools or whatever. He knows how to negotiate. Very, very successful.
That's just something that has become so to the forefront of a conference commissioner that wasn't before. It just wasn't. And understanding the market is such a huge piece. That's why the Big 12's here and the Pac-12 isn't. I mean, understanding what's available in the market and the opportunities and taking advantage of them, in my opinion, that's how the Survivor was picked. But
yeah,
I want to go to this. When Texas and Oklahoma announced they were leaving, or we found out through the media, it was a punch to the gut for everyone. It was, I don't think any of us expected Texas to be a long-term partner, just because, I'll be honest, you don't have to comment this. They never really wanted to be a partner. They wanted to be a boss. And Oklahoma, though, stung because of the long, 100+ years of time spent in a conference with them. But it also hit me that once that decision was made, the remaining schools kind of tied themselves together. Sure, everyone looked out for their best interests, but I thought I saw this conference kind of come together in a way we really hadn't seen since its formation in '96.
I think that's a very great point, Tim. I would totally agree with you. And some of this I have to give credit to Bob Bowlesby, because had we not immediately or very rapidly added the 4 that we did, I think the bleeding would have continued, and those 8 that you said were kind of bound together, I think it reinforced that let's lock arms, guys, because we just added these 4, and it gave us, okay, so the free fall has stopped, and now we can kind of reassess where we are and think about what we're doing. The ironic thing is we couldn't have moved as quickly as we did on adding those 4 had we not gone through all the drama that we did a couple of years earlier when David Board made the comment that he did about, being psychologically disadvantaged at 10 and we needed to go and explore. And, that was a difficult process to go through when we ended up not adding anybody, but it clearly left us with an idea of, if we ever do have to go back, we've identified who makes the most sense for us based on what we learned in that process. And so I think that's what allowed Bob to go quickly land those four, get them locked in, and kind of stop the bleeding, as I mentioned earlier.
Well, was this an effect of Bob now being untethered from Texas and able to just go do his thing?
Untethered. Boy, that's a great question. How to put it? Listen, there's no question that Texas carried a tremendous amount of clout, as did Oklahoma, and for a while, so did Nebraska and Texas A&M. And trying to manage those dynamics, I watched Kevin Weiber deal with that. I watched Dan Beebe deal with it, and there was a lot of art as opposed to science in trying to deal with them. But as much as I despised Texas while I was at Kansas State and enjoyed every time we beat them, when I came to the conference office, I could tell what that school meant to this conference. There's no question that the eyeballs that they brought to anybody that they were playing in this league mattered, and our TV partners let it be known. So in the big scheme of things, I think our league benefited greatly from having Texas and Oklahoma.
I agree with that.
And I hate that they're not in the league, just like I hate the fact that Nebraska and A&M aren't in the league. So, but in the end, those schools are going to do what I would have done at Kansas State, and that's first and foremost take care of Kansas State or Texas or Oklahoma. That's their responsibility, and that was the decision they made. So I get that. I wish that we would have had a chance to have sat down with both Texas and Oklahoma and say, well, okay, what is your concern? Finances? Is that really what this is about? And if it was, which in the end, I don't think that was the case for Texas, it may have been for Oklahoma, but to have had a chance to talk about what we could do and how we could maybe change our revenue sharing to address that. But I think in the end, it was about them wanting to be in a conference that allowed them to play and compete against schools that are bigger brands in some cases than what the Big 12 had, not necessarily in all cases, but in some cases, was what drove Texas primarily and to a degree Oklahoma. But they mattered a lot and made our conference a better conference.
So we go back a year at Big 12 media and Pac-12 media days. There was so much drama around the future of the Pac, and would the four corner schools end up in the Big 12, which is exactly what happened. How good of additions are those schools? It seems to really having Colorado back is wonderful, but they're a good connecting piece to the other schools. And I know that the Arizona schools, particularly Arizona, has some history with Tech.
Yep.
I just think it's a good fit, even though it takes the conference a little farther west than ever before.
Yeah, first of all, they're good brands. Arizona Wildcat basketball, Arizona State, gosh, for years when I was at Wichita State, football was so successful there. Of course, Utah has been, Colorado now. I think those brands will help us. You're right, it stretches us geographically, but it puts us in time zones that I think are beneficial from a TV standpoint. I think the challenge that we have now is to try and create schedules that relieve some of the stress and pressure associated with trying to get a West Virginia volleyball team out to BYU or
Right.
Utah or whatever. Baseball, there's a lot of that we're still going to have to fine tune and try and create some scheduling parameters that make sense to eliminate both the travel costs, the wear and tear on the student athletes, the missed class time, some of those things that we're still in the process of trying to figure out. But are we better off with those four than we were? Yes. No, there's no question our league is a better league because of those four.
My neighbor is setting off fireworks already. I'm not in favor of this. The poor dogs are upstairs, probably huddling. The funny thing about this whole situation is it's been the Utah fans that have pushed back the most and kind of caused the most ruckus, if you want to call it that. And I think they're the ones that are best fit to be in this conference, and they don't have a clue. Everything I've heard about Utah football, the Utah campus, I'm like, that's a Big 12 institution. So I think some of these schools fit in really well, and I think they also stretch this conference in good ways. Having Colorado back is wonderful, and moving into Arizona and those two schools' cultures, I think that's really cool opportunity for the conference. But 16's big, man, and it doesn't
It
look like
is.
it's stopping. Now, going back to what you said with the scheduling, would there almost be an advantage of getting to 20 or even 24 so you can divide up into, I don't want to call them mini conferences, divisions where those sports don't travel very much. They just stay within the most regional grouping of schools.
So, yeah, I suppose you could make that argument, but the biggest challenge to any addition of schools is going to be who's going to pay those
Right.
fees, because our ads would tell you right now they're already strapped,
Mhm.
and to bring more mouths to the table to feed is going to be increasingly difficult for us to do that, absent the TV partners stepping up and saying, hey, we'll increase your rights fees to offset that. So from a math standpoint, yeah, you probably could make some sense out of additional schools, which, by the way, Tim, for the first time in how many years, as we sit here today, we truly are the Big 12 in terms of the right number, because with Texas and Oklahoma leaving, we're, if I'm not mistaken, truly at 12
Yep.
for a month, and then we'll be to the 16 that you're talking about. So,
Yeah.
but I think that's going to be the challenge. If we add any schools, I think there's going to have to be some understanding of how they share in the revenue.
Right. Right. Okay. I've got this opinion. I'm going to share it with you. I've never accepted that the Big 12 is a new conference. I've always seen it. I mean, the entire Big 8 was in this conference. So I've always thought, even though it's not classified that way, it was an expansion of the Big 12. But all of those records were set aside. And within the 25, 26 year history so far of the Big 12, or is it longer than that? Oh my gosh, 28. Those records are self-contained. I think either with this new conference, you go back and add in the Big 8 records and say, this is our conference. This has been our conference. Or you start over again and remove Texas and Oklahoma from the equation altogether. I personally think you go back and add the Big 8 records in, because that's really the history of this conference. And it just kind of got shoved aside by the addition of 4 Southwest Conference schools.
Well, I was just going to say, so what do you do with the Southwest Conference records? Do they get shoved into this league then too?
Well, the league doesn't own the rights to the league, does it? I mean, Southwest Conference just went defunct, didn't it?
It did, but it's a good point. I'm not quite sure of the things that keep me awake at night. That wouldn't be probably at the top of my list.
Right.
Yes, I can tell. It does. It does register with you. We've struggled trying to figure out, how do you recognize as a conference? Do you recognize the Nebraska Heisman Trophy winners? Do you recognize the departed schools and the history they've had? Because of what, for some, that's a sensitive topic. We've got schools in our league right now that don't really want to acknowledge and have any sort of historical reference with those years, because that was then and this is now. And so I think you'd have some schools that would push back on, it should be about the schools that are in the league now.
Okay. Well, I don't disagree with that either.
It's another one of the nuanced pieces when you've evolved as much as the Big 12 has. And You're right, the Big 8. And some of this, I've often wondered, is some of what we've dealt with over the years because of how this league came to be in terms of shotgun marriage, and 2 leagues put together that maybe wanted to and maybe didn't want to, but okay, we got to because it makes sense. And then away we go, versus what you see in the history of the Big Ten, or in the history of the SEC, or the Pac-12 when it had a thriving conference. But we've struggled, I think, because we are considered the youngest of those power conferences. We don't have the history and the brand awareness that some of the other ones do, but that hasn't kept us from being competitive. That certainly hasn't hurt us from that standpoint.
Nope, it hasn't. How exciting is this to have? It really feels like a reset button. I know you just added 4 schools a year ago, but to have half the conference new within a 13-month period is kind of remarkable.
It is. And as I've told people, I think it's been fascinating to watch how the 8 that we've added, the way in which they're embracing this new conference for them. The 4 that we added a year ago, as you might guess, they couldn't run fast enough and jump high enough to get in this league. And we all understand why, given where they were. The 4 that are soon going to be joining, I think there's still some angst about what happened to the Pac-12 and how that the departure of Oregon and Washington and USC and UC, how that all led to the demise of that conference. So, they all are coming in a little bit different pace and mentality. So it's been fascinating to watch the dynamics between the 4 that we added a year ago, the 4 that we're adding, and then you combine it with the 8 that survived, the legacy members, as we kind of have called ourselves. And it makes for a unique stew of mentality and approaches.
Yeah, it's going to be a very interesting thing to watch this year. I'm ready for games to kind of heal some wounds here to start playing football.
Me too. Me too.
But so according to the timeline, the 4 new schools won't technically be in the conference when we hold Big 12 Media Days.
That's correct. I think it's an August 1 date, if I'm not mistaken. And I think that's in large part because of the Pac-12 finish date for them.
Is it all right for us to haze their members of the media? Just, to do weird stuff to them in Vegas. It's Vegas. I mean, you're not officially part of this conference. What are you doing here? That kind of stuff.
Well, far be it from me to ever tell the media what to think and do. So no, I couldn't even imagine responding to that.
No. Well, I look forward to the event. As people are seeing this, it's only a day away. So I'm sure I've seen you by the time most people see this.
I'm looking forward to it. Perhaps we'll get a chance to chat out there again too.
You bet we will. Thanks, Tim. Appreciate it so much.
Good to see you, Tim. Glad to hear you're doing well.
I am. Okay, I got to tell you something. During the taping of this, it was July 1, and my neighbor started setting off the big boom fireworks in the middle of the day, scaring the crap out of me twice. I hope you can see that in the podcast because it was right outside my window. Tim said he couldn't hear him, so that's good. That's good. But I sure do miss Tim Weiser being at K-State, even though I love the crew that we have now. And I was honest with him. After his departure, there were some really rocky times covering Kansas State athletics. There just didn't seem to be that kind of cohesive feeling that was here in the early 2000s. And now it's back. And Gene Taylor's done an incredible job of weaving together an amazing staff. Kansas State football, basketball, athletics seems to be on an all-time high. It seems to be headed for even better things. The Big 12 Conference, well, it's in an all-time new place. Who would have thought a few years ago when everyone was forecasting the end of the Big 12 that the leadership in Dallas and the leadership on campuses would lead this conference into this new 16-team alignment, a new Big 12, so to speak. And we'll see what the future holds because college athletics continues to change. And boy, the older I get, the harder change becomes. That's it for this episode. Thank you so much for watching. And I know you have a choice in what you spend your time with. So I'm so glad you spend some time with Life of Fitz. We'll keep doing these. And until then, I'll see you real soon. I appreciate you listening to this week's edition of Life of Fitz. And thank you to all the great people at Blueville Nursery for sponsoring our show. This has been a Spirit Street production.